So, some of us have had a few weeks, a few months with the Quad Cortex now, and I wanted to ask the kind of question, is it ready for the stuff that you're going to need it to do? So, for me, I think a lot of people have enjoyed the tones of the Quad Cortex, so I think there's plenty of people that have got what they want out of it tonally. I think I've not heard too many people saying too many things like, oh, it sounds whatever. However, I have noticed that some people end up doing exactly the same things that they would on any other modeler, and this is kind of across the board anyway. So I've read people recently saying that on the Axe 3 they've had to cut things down to 8 kHz, high cuts, 8 kHz, that sort of stuff, struggling potentially with FR. Obviously on the Helix we're very used to using high cuts and stuff for certain things, particularly high gain stuff, and the Quad Cortex is kind of similar in that regard. So I think some people have found, you know, if you're using high gain tones, that you're going to want to adjust those kind of high frequencies, and you can do that using an EQ after the cab. Or the other thing that you could do is go into the cab and move the mics closer to the edge of the cone. That tends to tame off some of that brightness, I found anyway. Well, it's sort of brightness, but it's also sort of that fizzy aspect of what's going on. But I think that is kind of somewhat normal anyway. Probably fair to say we've also got our basic food groups in terms of amps. Got a fair range of the classics, so like a few Marshalls, a few Fenders, and a few Vox type things. And then you've got some of the more boutique stuff, so maybe Friedman, maybe some of the Mesa Boogie stuff. And then obviously the high gain area is pretty well covered by the Quad Cortex. I think there are those folks out there that would really like to see some of the 14 stuff ported across, particularly some of those guys that have a focus in heavy music. I think some of those guys really like the 14 plugins. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about that, but I think those are some of the plugins that some of the metal guys do use quite a lot, as well as I guess the parallax stuff would be useful to have in the Quad Cortex, presumably. So where potentially things that I think people might want that is not currently in there is sort of things like time syncing your modulations. So if you've got things like a tremolo, for instance. Yeah, so if you've got something like a tremolo at the moment, you can't sync that to your click or your tap. I definitely think that would be something that people are going to be interested in. Like sometimes, you know, if you've got a vibrato or trem or modulation, it's often nice to be able to sync that to something. Another thing that I think is going to become more and more important is being able to color code your scenes or your foot switches and that stuff. So for instance, my eyes aren't great and this doesn't have scribble strips. So for me, I think it would be important to have, you know, these to be able to custom color code them. And also in some ways I feel like it might be better if they weren't in the main grey. So the majority of that screen at the moment is grey and you've just got the green for whichever scene you're on. I don't know if that would work incredibly well for me on stage. I know like the Helix LT, because that doesn't have scribble strips, I think they have bigger kind of colour blocks so that you can get a visual sense of what's going on. I guess in theory I might end up using a template anyway, in which case I would have the same thing in roughly the same areas every time. So another area which I think would make sense would be to have a kind of split mode where you have scenes and stomps. I don't think I'd need 8 scenes. So I think generally 4 tones is kind of sweet spot for me for most of my gigs. So I would use 4 scenes, and then maybe to have the ability to have 4 stomps along the top might be a useful and more flexible way of doing things. So you know, you could have a tube scream at the top, delay, reverb and so on, and then your scenes at the bottom which would, you know, do the things that you expect. So, you know, switching parameters, switching amps, that sort of stuff. I think maybe that might be a thing that might be useful for folks, possibly. We're starting to see people taking them out and about, and I think people are powering them quite often with the Chiox stuff. I think that's how you say that. So that's interesting to see people not really using the supplied power supply too much. I think quite a few people are using it as part of a bigger board as well, because of the size. I think the size is definitely one of the things that people are still really enjoying about the Quad Cortex. You know, as a piece of hardware to take around, that's pretty cool to be able to do the stuff that you can do with it. My experience with every other modeler, I feel like PC editors or Mac editors. Anyway, computer editors are definitely a big thing that people like to use, you know, pointing and clicking with a mouse and stuff. So I do wonder if that's something that people would like expedited. I think there was a price rise with the Quad Cortex, so I think it's now £1,600 at Anderton's, so definitely worth bearing in mind the stage that we're kind of at. So worth kind of looking around at some more videos of what's going on if you're thinking, do I want one of these, do I not? Will it do what I need or will it not? So there are going to be little things that potentially other modelers can do at the moment that the Quad Cortex isn't quite there with at the moment. So like I say, that flexibility of the foot switching is not really there yet. Likewise, kind of like the depth of some of the effects is not really there, you know, and things like being able to time sync modulation, that's not really there yet. They have kind of laid out a short-term roadmap for what's coming and the things that they're working on and prioritising, and I don't think those aspects are in there yet. I think they were working on a new flanger though for one of the things. I've not seen too many people doing stuff with MIDI implementation because I'm not really a MIDI person. I'm probably not the best person to talk about any of that, but that might be interesting to see from some people who are gigging. So if you are gigging the Quad Cortex, it'd be great if you could leave a comment and let us know your experience. So I've not gigged it yet. My first gig back is in a couple of weeks and it's going to be on bass, so I doubt I'll be using the Quad Cortex anyway. But are there some things in there that you wish it could do that it doesn't do yet? That kind of thing, I guess we could talk about that. Are you finding it easy? So I think I've not seen too many people complaining about the foot switches once they've actually used the unit. I've not found it too much of an issue at all. Yes, they are close vertically. Horizontally, they're kind of the same as most other modelers, like that distance to there is the same as a Helix, but this distance is about half. I think some other people definitely want those plugins ported over, and I'm not sure when that's going to be either. Can it do everything that I would want it to do? It doesn't have a looper yet either. That would be cool. So sort of things on my wish list would be to have those foot switching options so you could have stomps and scenes. A looper would definitely be on my wish list. One thing that they're already working on, this multi-out thing, I guess would have been on my wish list. And then maybe some kind of improved colour coding or ability to colour code on these screens, I think would make it a little bit more giggable. I'm not particularly interested in PC editor, I kind of like to use the hardware. Figuring out why it does that thing might be useful. So when you first turn it off, it kind of makes this noise, which is not necessarily a huge issue, but it'd be worth knowing if you're taking it on stage and stuff. So that's kind of my wish list. How about you? Are you gigging the thing? Are you enjoying it? Is it ready for the big leagues, do you think? Let me know how you're getting on. Catch you in a little bit. If you want to like and subscribe, you could. There's other stuff about other modelers as well, obviously. Cheers.